The NBA is all about storylines, from heroic wins to tragic losses. We fans tune in to watch what our favorites will do in victory or defeat. But what's a good story without a compelling villain? Some players become villains unintentionally, while others embrace the identity, striking fear into the hearts of NBA teams and fans alike. Let's take a look at the most hated villains in NBA history. Starting off, we have perhaps the biggest trash talker in NBA history, Kevin Garnett. Few people could talk trash like Garnett did on the court. If you ask him, he did it to pump himself up as much as he did it to pressure his opponents. And that is where a huge difference lies between KG and other villains. He absolutely loved doing what he did. If he could piss you off, there was no line he wouldn't cross. In fact, I'm not sure if KG knows that there are lines you shouldn't cross. His intensity has always made other people back down. His most infamous moment has got to be his interaction with Carmelo Anthony, where he made some extremely disrespectful comments about Carmelo's wife, comparing her to Honey Nut Cheerios. And if that wasn't hilarious enough, he once called Charlie Villanueva a cancer patient because he was suffering from a disease that had made him bald. KG's adoption of his villainous persona is also something that he has willingly accepted due to his high energy and non-stop banter. His fan base loves KG's antics and realness both on and off the court. Next up, we have the original Bad Boys of Detroit, who were notorious for their persona as villains. Among the Detroit Piston Bad Boys, Bill Laimbeer and Isiah Thomas were two of the toughest players we've ever seen who just did what they had to do to win the game. Laimbeer was a 6'11" enforcer for the Pistons who presented nightmares for the high-usage players of the late 80s and early 90s, where he terrorized the opposition with his physicality. His ability to protect the paint made many old-school players either reinvent their style or suffer a world of pain. Bill was an old-school menace that never relented. He was the type of player you wanted most on your team, but someone that you dreaded going against. In a lot of ways, Laimbeer's physicality led to rule changes that protected the offensive player, which makes him one of the last players to use his physicality to unnerve opponents. In fact, to be able to intimidate and physically push around superstars like Bird and Jordan, Laimbeer was a special talent that was often overlooked because of his destructive play. His partner and leader, Isiah Thomas, was similar but different in the sense that he himself was more an advocate of psychological warfare, and would use physicality as a way to control the pace of the game and to throw off his opponent's rhythm. Beyond that, Isiah Thomas was a powerful personality in the locker room, and he needed to be to control the infamous Bad Boys and lead them to 2 championships. Speaking of tough, nobody was more than a villain of New York than the Knicks killer himself, Reggie Miller. Nowadays, when you see Reggie on Inside the NBA and in the commentary box hanging out with Chuck and Chris Webber, it's easy to forget that Miller was the stuff of nightmares for many different teams, especially the New York Knicks, who had a special place of torment in Reggie's heart. Miller came to be known as the Knicks Killer when he proved to be the villain to their team on multiple occasions in the 90s. His biggest moment as a ruthless competitor and heartless clutch player came against the Knicks when he scored 25 points in the fourth quarter to lead a comeback against them in Game 5 of the 1994 Eastern Conference Finals. It was on this night that we saw one of the most iconic villain moments of the 90s, when Miller silenced the Knicks crowd and Spike Lee with the choke sign after their team had blown a lead going into the fourth quarter. Many might not know, but Reggie's sister Cheryl Miller is considered one of the greatest female basketball players of all time. His childhood competing against his sister taught him to be a scrappy and unrelenting player. Now considered to be one of the greatest shooters of all time, Miller is one of the few players who is loved off the court but was absolutely hated on it. Funny enough, Reggie wasn't the only one doing iconic chokes. Let's talk about the man who kept his choking off the court and was a terror to execs and coaches. Sprewell is the only villain on the list whose playstyle isn't rough and violent. But then again, if you put your hands on the throat of your head coach and almost choke him out, you deserve to be on this list. During his career, Sprewell received 4 NBA All-Star selections and an All-NBA first-team selection. Despite his accomplishments, Latrell completely jeopardized his career because of his temper and faded into obscurity, only to be remembered for his controversies. Latrell's story, however, is one of tragedy instead of redemption. His violent outburst cost him his entire season and led to a 68-game suspension. Even after his return, nobody took Sprewell seriously, and it seemed as if the NBA world had moved past the uncontrollable relics of the past. But in a way, his story was bigger than basketball. Yes, he can never be forgiven for choking out his coach, but everybody knows Sprewell was villainized by the mainstream media, for whom he was too raw, too powerful, and uncontrollable. That is why his 1999 finals run as a Knick is often forgotten. Even though he had helped lead an 8th seed to the finals against the Spurs and had an amazing performance. In fact, he was the only player to put up 35 points in the elimination game when the rest of the team faltered. That's why it's important to understand how the media affects our thinking and perception of these athletes. Our next NBA player has to be the legendary villain himself, Metta World Peace. Ironically, for someone who has Peace as his last name, the man formerly known as Ron Artest was all about throwing it down. While you'll see many players employ the hold me back or come outside strategy these days, Artest wanted none of that meet me in the tunnel after the game BS. He was the epitome of any time, any place, and that fierceness extended to the court, making him worth all his issues. He was a controversial figure throughout his career, and his involvement in the largest and most violent brawl in NBA history made him infamous. He kick-started the Malice at the Palace in 2004 when he shoved Ben Wallace as he was attempting a layup. For this, Artest was suspended for the rest of the season and heavily fined for his actions. He is one of the few villains in NBA history that truly didn't care about public perception and did whatever he wanted. Regardless of his status as a villain, fans were thrilled to see his redemption arc where he teamed up with Kobe Bryant to get to the promised land and showed the world that he was more than the stereotypes associated with him. He did that spectacularly against the Celtics in Game 7, where he hit a clutch three-pointer to put the Lakers out of reach and to ensure the Lakers would go back-to-back. Next on our list is one player you never knew what to make of, Dennis Rodman. He was vital to teams he played for, and in his own unique way, the MVP of multiple tough series against top-caliber teams. For many in the 90s, Rodman was the most fearless competitor they had ever seen. For some others, he was the epitome of love him or hate him, and in those days, the bar tended to lean more towards hate. Unless you were a fan of the Pistons in the late 80s or the Bulls in the late 90s, you probably hated Dennis the Menace with a passion. But with hindsight, it's hard not to look back and see Rodman for who he really was, an introvert who truly felt at home on the basketball courts and someone who was ready to die if it meant the team could win. His antics were a way to express himself, as we saw in The Last Dance. Rodman was close to ending everything after falling into despair in a 1993 incident. In his autobiography, he mentions that instead of ending his life, he decided to end the old Dennis, the one who wanted to conform to what others wanted him to be. After this transformation, it wasn't hard to look at Rodman and picture a madman who was living moment to moment, and it was this unpredictability that unnerved opponents, many of whom cracked under the pressure of facing Dennis the Menace. It was his devotion to Jordan and Phil that the Bulls were able to complete their three-peat. Let's not forget their last year together. Scotty's injury thrust Rodman into the second spot for more than half the season, a task he more than lived up to. For our last villain is one that many love today, but was someone who often broke the hearts of fans. We're talking about none other than the legendary Kobe Bryant. Although many might not remember it, Kobe had an entire commercial dedicated to his status as the villain of the NBA, as he was hated by the other 29 teams. Unlike any other before him, Bryant would use the publicity of his villainous nature and launch a branding campaign that saw him become one of the most famous players in history. He relished and thrived in the role of everybody's most hated player. But while others might be hated for their physicality, bad nature, or even their playing style, Bryant was feared for the damage he could do to your favorite team on any given day. His career showed everyone that even villains can be loved, and by the time of his retirement, we saw team after team pay Kobe tribute, even though he had destroyed their teams multiple times and sunk daggers into the hearts of millions of fans. Truly, Kobe presents the shift in the public narrative about players who stand up for themselves and aren't afraid to be villainized for the sake of a better story. By the time his career was over, people were chanting for him worldwide, and it really didn't matter who the villain was. Do you guys know of any other NBA villains? Let us know in the comments below. If you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to click this next one on the screen. Go ahead and click it. It's free,